In 1819, a time of high unemployment and rampant poverty, tens of thousands of mostly working-class men, women and children gathered in St Peter's Field, Manchester, demanding universal male suffrage. But cavalry charged into the crowd with their sabres drawn, killing and injuring hundreds in what became known as the Peterloo massacre. This is working-class history.
Good people give ear, since times are so hard. My song to the poor, it doth pay some regard. For trade being dead, I'm weaving out of hope. But I hope in a few months, it will make amends for all.
Hi, and welcome back to the Working Class History Podcast. I'm John.
And I am Rakan.
The Peterloo Massacre on the 16th of August 1819 was a pivotal moment in British history, particularly in terms of the fight for the right to vote. It's now the subject of a major feature film, Peterloo, directed by Mike Leigh, which is in cinemas now. We are very pleased to be joined by Mike and Dr. Jacqueline Riding, historical consultant on the film and author of Peterloo, the story of the Manchester Massacre, to speak about the history of this event and the film. Dotted throughout this episode, we're also including some audio clips from the film itself.
Maybe you could start by telling us kind of a little bit about the historical background to the Peterloo Massacre, kind of what kind of the social issues were for people in the area at the time, and that kind of thing.
Well, this is the post-Waterloo period. So we've had 22 years of warfare. Coupled with that, there's been failed harvests in the summer of 1816, known as the Year Without Summer, because of a volcanic eruption in 1815. There's food riots, there's unemployment, you've got the disbanded veterans of Waterloo coming back to Great Britain and exacerbating an already sort of troubled labour market. So it's a perfect storm.
And so these are kind of the issues which were in people's minds, I suppose, when they were kind of preparing for Peterloo. On the actual day of the massacre, can you give us a little timeline of how that kind of day looked?
So the event itself was intended to be the final mass meeting in the regions in order to petition for the universal male suffrage. It was seen that not having the vote was the key to all the troubles and ills of the labouring man. And as we know, in this period, there was something like 3% of the population actually had the vote. So the vote was seen as the key. And in fact, the reformers, such as William Cobbett, Henry Hunt and so on, had managed to mobilise both the middle but the working labouring class towards peaceable means by which they would petition for the vote. But also the removal of the corn laws that artificially inflated the price of basic foodstuffs like bread and so on and so forth. So, but they'd managed to mobilise both the middle but predominantly the labouring class away from rioting and violence towards these peaceable means, where the petitioning Parliament, but in this instance, the mass forum, the mass meeting movement, which was very much headed by Henry Hunt. He was the great advocate for it. So St Peter's Field, 16th of August, 1819, as I say, was intended to be this monster meeting, massive regional meeting. After 9 months throughout 1819, various meetings occurring across the country. This is very much a national programme, a union of the people. St Peter's Field, 16th of August, was going to be this prominent final regional moment. And then there was going to be a mass meeting on Kennington Common, which will ring some bells because of the Chartist movement and the mass meeting in the 1840s. But, as we know, what happens is that between 60 and 80,000 people arrive in Manchester on St Peter's Field, which is a reasonably small, several acres piece of rough land which had started to be built on. It was being developed. But it was still a meeting place, a regular meeting place for Mancunians, for political rallies and so on, and mass meetings. 60 to 80,000 people came. The population of Manchester was about 100,000, 120,000. So you got 80,000 people turning up to one small space. You can see why. And this is no excuse for what the magistrates did, but you can see why there was a nervousness about this sudden over-doubling, or half the population of Manchester. There were people from Manchester, obviously, on the field, but they came from all over Lancashire, the West Riding of Yorkshire, A lot of promotion had been done up to the day, so everyone knew it was going on. So there's a lot of people. Henry Hunt had specifically requested and asked that those that came didn't come armed, because he knew that one little tiny hint of violence or sort of aggression would simulate the magistrates to send the civil powers would send in the military power in support of them, and they would break up the meeting. And it would ruin the whole momentum that had occurred throughout the year with this demonstration of strength for reform in Parliament.
If any man is armed with so much as a stone on Monday, there will be no meeting at which I will speak.
There are a large body of men signed up at Manchester.
And women, and children. And it is them that I seek to protect.
I am speaking at Manchester and Salford Yeomanry, sir. A large body of men are signed up, and weapons have been widely distributed amongst them.
And it is precisely for that reason that we must give them no provocation.
But these are men who are not only politically adverse to our cause, sir, but also personally adverse to us.
Mr. Bamford.
Are we to lead our young uns and our wives and our sweethearts into the mouth of such a threat without means of defending them?
Mr. Bamford, I understand your fears, but you have not been to a mass meeting as this promises to be. I have. I have spoken at meetings in London of over 100,000 people, and at those meetings, not one blade of grass, not a gust of wind, has been the recipient of a single act of violence. Had they been, the authorities would have taken it as permission to break up not only the meeting, but the entire movement. I will not have my reputation and name and the virtues which I espouse besmirched for the behaviour of a single group of men.
This is Lancashire, sir, and authorities here have no regard for their reputation or anybody else's. And meetings of this nature hereabouts invariably end in violence.
That is because they have not been addressed by me.
So he was very, very clear he didn't want any violence at all. It seems that the vast majority of the people, if not all of them, had completely followed his request and were very peaceful. They had arrived with their wives and their children, so there weren't just men in the group, there were women and children too. Women were very prominent in the reform movement at this period. In the July before the August, Manchester had its very own female reform society who was supporting their menfolk in their desire for the vote, for their petitioning for the vote and so on. So it was as far as we know and as far as we can tell from all the eyewitness accounts, it was a very peaceful, it was a large group, but a very peaceful group. The magistrates are sitting in a house on the southeastern side of the field, watching all these people turning up, and are clearly getting more and more agitated as more people enter the field, and they can see how big the sheer scale of the meeting. They have been advised by the Home Office that this is not an illegal meeting, so they have to allow it to go ahead, and they shouldn't do anything until any sedition becomes apparent. So if Henry Hunt said something seditious, then they would have legally they would have the wherewithal to arrest Hunt and then get the military to clear the field. Unfortunately, they're obviously starting to not quite panic by this point, but as these people are turning up, they're realising the sheer scale of it. Henry Hunt arrives and there's an enormous cheer, 80,000 people cheering at the same time, which again set them off. The magistrates just all talk about this amazing roar from the crowd. But again, it was just a cheer for the main event, which was Henry Hunt. Henry Hunt gets to the hustings with his group, which included Mary Files, the president of the Female Reform Society. They get onto the hustings. He more or less clears his throat. And the magistrates decide, having heard from various local businessmen who were fearful for their property and their lives because of this size of this meeting, they decide to arrest Henry Hunt, and they send notes out to the Yeomanry Cavalry, who were the local citizen regiment, so amateurs, and the military, who are the professionals, the hussars, the infantry, and so on. They send out for them both at the same time to support the arrest of Henry Hunt. Unfortunately, the Yeomanry Cavalry turn up first. They're almost certainly drunk, or at least some of them were drunk. They're amateurs. They wade into the field and then start to panic because they get trapped within this mass of people, and then start to sort of cause havoc by sabring and attacking the people. Then the hussars turn up, who are the professionals who know how to clear a field peaceably to an extent. These are very rudimentary techniques, but they know how to gently move forward and gently push people towards one side of the field rather than charging in. They're told to get in there and save the yeomanry because they're being attacked by the people, which is demonstrably not the case. But hussars have been told, they've been ordered to do what they do, and so they go in, and they cause probably as much injury to the people as the yeomanry cavalry. It's almost certain that if the hussars had arrived first, then I don't know whether we would have actually had a Peterloo massacre, because, as I say, there was no violence evident in the crowd whatsoever. And I think once you get a show of strength, 400 men on horseback is quite an impressive sight. And I think most people would have thought, no way, I'm going. So I think they would have managed to clear the fields with no violence and no injury whatsoever. Unfortunately, it was the yeomanry who came first. But I think ultimately you have to sort of go back one step and say who sent them in without any hint of any violence or sedition whatsoever. And I'm afraid it was the magistrates.
We must pluck the braying bellwethers from their schismatic pulpits, but we cannot incarcerate their entire godless flock. 3,000 fools stuffed into the New Bailey like anchovies in a pot. No, gentlemen. The rabble must be awed into submission. A mere show of military might would soon see them gambling like little lambs back to their looms.
They are ignorant souls. They know not what they want.
They are children.
Innocent babes.
Babes, perhaps, innocent never.
The rod is all they understand.
My son, fear thou the Lord and the King, and meddle not with them that are given to change.
Gentlemen, might I urge a little forbearance? The labouring classes are ruled by their stomachs. Were we to prevail upon the mill owners to furnish them with an additional shilling per week, their hunger would be alleviated, and this agitation would cease.
A shilling this week, 2 shillings next week, a guinea for Christmas.
This concerns not money. This concerns not an extension of the franchise. This concerns neither liberty nor freedom. The remedy, gentlemen, is the iron hand of the law.
And so how long did that process take of them kind of clearing it? Was that over in like a matter of 20 minutes, half an hour? Did it go on for...
No, I think most people, the eyewitnesses, basically described that by the time Henry Hunt had arrived on the field, to the fact that all there were crushed instruments and dead people and people crying and hats rolling across this open field. So literally there was nothing left apart from those injured who haven't been removed from the field. It was probably about half an hour.
And in terms of the number of people injured and the fatalities on the day, do you know what those numbers were?
Well, we know that at least 15 people died either on the day itself, so they died immediately, or they died later as a result of the injuries that had occurred. The most famous is John Lees, who is the veteran from Waterloo, who survived the foreign field only to be murdered, to die as a result of the injuries he got in his own country. So he's the famous victim. Yes, there's at least 15. There's about 600 known to have been injured. We know that certain people were injured because there was a relief fund that was created where they were raising money to support people who could not work because they had both arms in splints because they'd been beaten by the special constables. That's the kind of rudimentary police force, or indeed sabred by either the yeomanry or the hussars. So we know that there's about sort of 500 or so people listed, some of whom died later. So even though they survived the field, they might die from their injuries. But other people were so fearful of admitting to having been on the field in the first place that they just didn't report to anybody. They didn't claim any money. They didn't go to the local hospital because they were being told off for having been on the field in the first place. And so the actual numbers is we just don't know. So we know at least 15, probably about 18 people died. An unborn child was born prematurely as a result of the mother being beaten on the field, being within the event. So it's everybody from an unborn child to older people. It's desperate. And some people say, well, it's not 15 people is terrible, but it's not a massacre on the scale of others that we might point towards. Seems to me that only one person dying is bad enough. This is the British state but also the local authorities turning troops onto their own people when all they were doing was demanding what I think most of us would agree is the perfect right of every citizen of this country.
Yeah. A large amount, a proportion of these casualties were apparently women, as women were, as you mentioned already, heavily involved in the events. Do you know if women had a kind of distinct set of demands which they took there? Or was it solely about supporting kind of the men?
The women were there in the first instance to support the men in their struggle for the vote. So it was about universal male suffrage. But the women, it's really and very clever the way that they couch it, the way they term it, because they see the vote of their menfolk within their family as being a vote for the family. So if the men are represented, so is the family in Parliament. So that's how they see it. So the women, because of course, it was seen as a complete anathema for women to be involved in politics at all, let alone getting up on hustings and making speeches and so on. It was considered against the natural order. And so the women very cleverly, I think in some ways to not excuse what they're doing, but to couch it in terms that are perhaps more palatable, is to really talk very particularly about their area of expertise, which is the domestic space. It's the home, it's the family. Of course, women worked in the factories and they were hand loom weavers and so on, but they were very particularly using the context of the home as being their space of authority and expertise. And it was based on the trauma, the troubles that they were having within the domestic space to feed their children, the things had got so bad that we are leaving our space, as it were, and entering the public space because things are so bad. And so they, I think, rather cleverly couch their involvement in what's seen as very much a male preserve, which is politics. They're using their expertise as mothers and wives and sisters and so on to justify, and quite rightly too, their involvement in it. They are affected by the Corn Laws, of course. They're affected by 22 years of warfare. We are too. Our menfolk are. And they have no say in Parliament, therefore nor do we, nor does our family. So the women are very prominent. And of course this means that they are naturally, that they're seen, they're viewable, they're distinguishable. And a lot of the female reformers wore white, all white. And they're very prominent as a result. They're very, you can pick them out from a crowd. And it seems that they were being specifically targeted, particularly by the yeomanry. There's a lot of, Mary Fildes gets sabred. She's on the hustings, falls off the hustings, and then gets attacked. She's actually injured. So it does seem that the women were, amongst everything else, that women and the prominent reformers were being singled out.
Was it novel for that kind of time, that era, for women to be involved to the extent that they were?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is like Elizabeth Bennet acquiring a political conscience and social awareness, and forming her own reform society, turning up and then for her pains being sabred on at a political rally, because Jane Austen dies in 1817. 2 years later you've got Peterloo, and these women a lot of them are sort of lower middle class, I suppose. They're part of the middling sort in a way, but others are working women. They work in the factories. So it's Elizabeth Bennet, just imagine.
So in that sense, what was the aftermath of the massacre? In the days and kind of weeks after that, obviously the actual term Peterloo didn't come to existence until after it had happened. Before that,
within days though. I mean, they were making parallels between Waterloo. Obviously, that's where Peterloo comes from. It's St Peter's Field, the field of Waterloo. They're making that connection between a battlefield and a field in an urban, semi-urban environment, both with a battle, as it were. And even the military were describing it as a battle, even if they were being quite jokey about it. So those parallels were being made. There were veterans on both sides. Obviously, John Lees was a veteran, but you also had veterans of Waterloo in the Royal Horse Artillery. So the irony of it is beautifully sort of evident in that one word, Peterloo. So that occurs almost immediately and is promoted. What also happens quite quickly is this formation of this relief fund. And the way that, like one local, Archibald Prentice, who's key to one of the key members of the forming of the Manchester Guardian, he says that there was a shift in perception of the working labouring man. They were seen, these victims were seen as people, and there was a sense of fellow feeling. And he felt that it assisted, certainly in Lancashire, Manchester and Lancashire, in the drive for universal suffrage, for the reform of Parliament. So he very much makes that connection. The other thing, of course, is it doesn't matter what the government did, and they did a lot. Before the end of the year, you've got the Six Acts, which clamps down on everything. I mean, it's a major clampdown. Henry Hunt's arrested, Samuel Bamford's arrested, all the leaders are arrested. They all end up in prison for a year, 2 years. So the government did everything they could to clamp down on it. And in many ways, they were successful. But the labouring class were now in the habit of mobilising for parliamentary reform, and that they couldn't keep down, they couldn't crush. And as we know, we've got the Chartist movement is and the co-operative movement and so on. These are all major mobilisations of the labouring class.
One of the other things I wanted to ask about was kind of the balance between fictional and real characters in the film. And I guess that depends on how much kind of archive material is available. One of the characters I was interested in was the magistrate's spy or informer who's present in a lot of scenes. I mean, how do you strike that balance between fictional and fact in that case? Are there records of those kind of characters being around?
So whatever happens in the film is totally up to his nibs,
right, okay.
Mr. Mike Leigh.
Okay, yeah.
I'm there to feed information
right.
in regard to Oliver the spy. He was actually, in historical terms, he was a real person, but he was off the scene in 1817. Thing is, though, he's such a fascinating character. He's not just a spy; he's an agent provocateur, and he was in 1817. So the Blanketeer March and so on, he's involved in that. Very much encouraging insurrection and violence amongst the labouring class. So he's an agent provocateur. I think Mike liked that character because he's so well drawn, because even though he's quite a shady character, when he's operating, there is documentation at the National Archive about this person. And he was hired, and Lord Sidmouth, the Home Secretary, has direct in command over this individual. All the rest are sort of, to an extent, being paid for and used as informers by the local magistrates in Manchester and Lancashire. But this individual, for some reason, seems to be sort of directly under the command of the Home Secretary himself. So he's a fantastic and fabulous character. And I think, well, what he ends up being in our version of Peterloo, he becomes a kind of cipher for all the spies, all the agents provocateurs. We sort of rolled him all into one and called him Oliver, Mr. Richards. So we used a historical character, and then he exists slightly later in the film, historically or in time scale, than in reality. But he's such a great character that we thought we'd use him for that purpose.
Yeah, most of the film is set in an urban setting, but then there's important kind of interludes which are in the countryside or on the moors. Could you talk a little bit about how important those kind of getting away from the city was for kind of people organising at that time, and like having that, is it about having the space or kind of the freedom from surveillance to be there?
I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, they are drilling on the moors in order to make themselves organised so they couldn't be just dismissed as a mob. It meant that they would march in orderly fashion to Manchester, which could be 10 miles away, 15 miles away or whatever, because they're coming from all over Lancashire. But they wanted to arrive in some semblance of order, as I say, so they weren't dismissed as a mob. So, because marshalling 60 to 80,000 people and making sure they don't turn to violence and so on is an incredible thing. So they were sort of self-marshalling, they were organising it themselves and maintaining discipline. But it's important to show the scenes away from the urban environment because, as I say, they were coming from all over Lancashire and they were walking through that wonderful countryside towards the great what will become the industrial city of Manchester. So it felt like a sort of, I don't know about you, but I felt that it's like a rush of air floats through the scenes that you've been watching, all very urban and factories and busy and bustle. And then you get these wonderful scenes of the countryside, and it's just like a lung, it's like a breath of fresh air in the scenes for the film.
Next we hear from Mike Leigh, the director, who begins by telling us why he wanted to make a film about Peterloo.
Well, there's never been a movie about Peterloo. It's an important event. It's an interesting and actually, apart from its meaning. It was obviously a cinematic sort of event. When I say event, I mean the film doesn't only deal with the event itself, but with all kinds of aspects of things leading up to it. It seemed relevant to now in all sorts of fairly obvious ways. It isn't something that I'd thought about for a long time, but when I did get the idea about 5 years ago, and we said, okay, let's do this, and we started to look into it and research it and prepare the film, it did become almost on a daily basis. It became more and more obvious that this was an ever increasingly relevant subject in our territory. So that led us to us doing it.
So it's something which kind of came to you, do you think, rather than you went looking for it?
Yeah.
In that sense, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so obviously next year is the bicentenary of Peterloo, so it'll be 200 years.
Yeah.
Which is quite a milestone. How do you strike the balance between recounting a historical event, telling an engaging story, and also possibly a call to action in one film, do you think?
Well, in a way, given that it isn't a documentary, and there was never any question it wasn't going to be a documentary, it was going to be a dramatic distillation, because that's what I do. In a way, that looks after itself. You know, I mean, for example, the Battle of Waterloo was in 1815 and the Peterloo massacre was in 1819. So on paper, theoretically, the film spans 4 years. Now, when you watch the film, and this is a matter of sleight of hand on my part, if you like, you don't sit there thinking 4 years is going past. You don't think about how long it is or it isn't. Because historically, within those 4 years, all kinds of other stuff happened, which it would be not only impossible, but eccentric to even contemplate putting in a film, because the film is about getting to the essence of things, you know, distilling it. So in a way, the question, what about the problem of the balance between one thing and the other? In a way, balance isn't really what it's about. It's about going with the storyteller's, filmmaker's instinct and sense of what needs to be there to get to the essence of things, and letting that drive the decisions, really. Having said that, there's a lot in the film which is historically, you know, fairly accurate, you know.
And it is an inspiring film to watch. I mean, there's several, I mean, not even just the last scene, but I mean, kind of the speeches throughout. It does kind of come across in some ways as a call to action, I suppose, especially in the kind of context of present times. But I suppose that is quite an intentional thing.
I mean, you don't make a film about a great political sequence of events 200 years ago without being aware of what they mean, and nothing means anything except now. I mean, now, because now is where we are. So you cannot but resonate with the world we're in. So the job is to be as accurate as possible in the spirit and the details of what you are showing and investigating. But, you know, you don't have to do anything to make it contemporary or anything, because we can only decode it in 21st century terms.
They're going to London.
What, Bagley and that?
They're going to see the Prince.
What? They're not.
They are, ma'am.
Prince Regent it is.
Oh, aye. They're taking him this, what is it, Father?
Petition.
Aye, a petition.
What'll it say, Father?
It's a list of demands.
Oh, aye.
Our rights.
Hallelujah. Prince Thingamaby ain't going to give Apeth for a scrap of paper that's come all the way from Lancashire.
Well, if he don't, they're going to take it to the king.
And then what? He's as mad as a marcher.
And they said if he won't do out, they'll lock him up.
What, the king?
Aye, the king. And all his family.
Who's going to lock up the king? Them three lads?
No, the people will.
And how's the people going to do that? That's just plain daft.
At least they're doing something.
They're not doing out. It's just more talk.
I'll tell you what they're not doing, Nellie. They're not sitting on their backsides, waiting.
I know. I
don't blame you for losing hope, Mum.
I haven't lost hope, son. I'll never lose hope. Times is too hard to lose hope. Hope's all we've got. But you've got to start small. As they say, from little acorns, mighty oak trees grow.
One of the most interesting aspects of the film for me is that it sheds a lot of kind of colour on regional working class life at the time. I'm thinking about the details there's a lot of references to food that people ate and kind of the sharing of food, but also accents and kind of turn of phrase. Was that something you particularly wanted to?
Well, again, it's not a question of something I particularly wanted to do. It comes with the territory. I mean, if you're telling that story, then that's what you have to do. I mean, we are talking about 200 years ago. We are talking about the northwest of England, and we're talking about those dialects, if that's what you're referring to. Just as we were concerned with the language used by the educated magistrates and so on and so forth. So it's not a question of me saying, well, that's a particular thing that I wanted to do. That is what it requires, because those are the people in question. Then it's a matter of digging in and doing the research and working out how to make that world come to life, and how to make that language happen, and how to bring those voices to life.
You spoke about it not being a documentary, but there obviously is a lot of kind of real characters in it. Do you find, how do you strike the balance between those kind of fictional and real characters?
Well, it's not a question of a balance, it's a question of a mixture. I mean, there are a lot of very specific characters that we've portrayed, but of course it was important that at the centre of it all you had to see the kind of a sample of the ordinary person in the street that was at the centre of the whole issue. So we created this fictitious family who are just that. I mean, they are, they're not, in fact, they're quite, in some respects, quite innocent politically. They attend the meetings, they are discovering these new ideas, they debate them, the wife's not sure, the mother. The son comes back from having been a bugler at Waterloo in some state of stress. Bad things happen to him. But those are created offset against portraits of real people that exist, including the Prince Regent and so on.
And so where was most of the filming done? Was it done around Manchester and that kind of
Not
area?
one frame of the film was shot in Manchester, ironically. I mean, when we started on the project, I said, as you would expect, I said, well, of course, we must shoot it all in Manchester. Well, they built a great Victorian city where it all happened after 1819 for the rest of the 19th century. And since then, they've built a great modern city, and, it's full of new high-rise blocks with fancy apartments in them, and there's a whole tram system that runs around the streets and so on. So there was no question, and we couldn't shoot in Manchester. So we shot in Gainsborough and Lincoln, where there are still half-timbered buildings such as there would have been in Manchester 200 years ago. We shot in Burnley in a mothballed mill. We shot on the moors, Saddleworth Moor, and there's moors, Lancashire and Yorkshire border. We shot in Chatham Docks, where lots of people shoot period films, because it lends itself to all kinds of locations. And above all, we shot the actual Peterloo massacre about as far away from Manchester as you can get, at the fort at Tilbury, which is an ancient, huge parade ground with some buildings that we were able to take over and convert into St Peter's Field in Manchester.
I guess it wasn't just about urban people, this is about rural people as well, who came to this event and participated on the day. It was kind of...
People came from all over Lancashire, and indeed some people came over the border from Yorkshire. Right, 62... some reckon there were 100,000 people then. But certainly the minimum was 60,000. But that's a lot of people, and, they just came from all over the show, really. And that was important to show that, But as you say, it's also important, a lot of people mill workers, would have come from the country anyway, originally, because the city, Manchester as an industrial city, grew very fast at an amazing speed from the last decade and a half or so of the 18th century into the period we're talking about. I mean, the factories, the mills, sprung up overnight, really, because it was a great burgeoning cotton industry.
Do you feel there are much commercial pressures which hamper this kind of film, or kind of generally kind of working class film in general, telling these kind of stories?
I think, in a way, the answer to the question you're asking is not so much what's hampered or repressed, although this may well be what happens, but that there's a tendency to make films about idealised, exotic ideas of people, which is partly a function of the age we live in. I'm concerned, actually, it's not so much a matter of making films about the working class. I think it's important to do that, and I've done a lot of it. It's actually important to make films, as far as I'm concerned, and this is my own agenda, about real people, in a way, irrespective of who they are. Because everybody, it's valid to talk about society from a whole bunch of angles. It's wrong to think that the only job is to talk about the working class life. That's part of what I think is the remit of responsible filmmaking, which is to look at the world and question it on all kinds of levels.
As well as the political impact, the Peterloo Massacre had a big cultural impact as well. A particularly well-known example is the poem The Mask of Anarchy by Percy Shelley. One of the actors in the film, Maxine Peake, read the poem at a picnic commemorating the events in 2015.
Men of England, heirs of glory, heroes of unwritten story, nurslings of one mighty mother, hopes and hair of one another, rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few.
No! The corrupt order will come crashing down!
As always, we've got links to more information and further reading, as well as to Jacqueline's book in the show notes below. Do go watch the film and let us know what you think. We're on Twitter at WRK Class History. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks to Mike Leigh and Dr. Jacqueline Riding for speaking with us. Thanks to Jesse French for editing. Thanks to Nev Dunn for the audio of the poem. And as always, special thanks to our Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible. You too can support us. Get early access to episodes and other benefits at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. You can find out more about our project on our website at workingclasshistory.com, where we've also got an online store with radical history merchandise to help fund our work. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Catch you next time.